It's true that, in Europe, they were the target of, um, unspeakable crimes against humanity, and they were the victim of Europeans. But in the context of Palestine, they're not the victims. They're definitely not my victim. They're not the victims of my grandparents. And they're not the victims of 6 million Palestinian refugees who are denied the right of return. They're not the victims of people living under apartheid in the West Bank or Gaza. So in this case, they're not the victim. And it's important to kind of make that distinction.
Welcome, Noura. Thank you very much for joining me for this episode dedicated to Palestine. How are you today?
I'm good. Thank you so much, Mehdi. Thanks for inviting me, and thank you for all of the hard work that you do.
Oh, thank you. It's not hard work. It's much fun, really, to be honest. But yeah, thank you. So first of all, Noura, just to start demystifying things, can you tell us a little bit about Palestine and like the cultural and ethnic and religious background of Palestine before the Zionist invasion?
Sure. So Palestine, obviously, as everyone knows, is the hub of cultures in that region specifically. Palestine's history dates back to at least 4,000 years. We have even some research saying that in Jericho, there's been some finding that it dates back to 10,000 years. So we're constantly learning in that sense. So so that area has been inhabited for at least what we know for the last 4,000 years. And there's been many cultures and many civilizations that have gone through, lived through, and left their imprint on the region. And of course, from the Byzantine to Cleopatra to the Ottomans, and today the Zionists. But it's important to discuss, I think, and defend that diversity when we talk about Palestine, because Palestine, and if you're a Palestinian and if you're someone who was raised and born in Palestine, you learn to love the whole culture, the whole mix of it. So we learn about how Judaism is an important part of the Palestinian culture. We learn about how Christianity is native, obviously, to Palestine, to Bethlehem, to Nasri, Nazareth, and other parts in the Galilee, for instance, in 1948 territories. And we also, of course, learn about how Islam is linked and connected to the region for the last 1,400 years. Palestinians and specifically also Arabs have been living there and basically contributing to the culture and to the landscape in Palestine.
What about your own history, like the most recent history of your ancestors, especially since the Nakba? Can you tell us a bit how they were living before and what happened afterwards?
Sure. So my family is counted amongst what we call in Palestine, or in 1948, also known as Israel today, is internally displaced people. So they're refugees who became internal refugees, but not necessarily external refugees. So I was born in Akka, beautiful coastal city on the north of Palestine. My parents, though, both of them originally are not from Akka. Their parents, my grandparents, my mother's side is from a village in the Galilee called Sha'ab, and my father's father is from Safad, also a very known and famous Palestinian city, who's actually today don't have any Palestinian residents, and it's really hard for a Palestinian to secure a house or even rent an apartment in Safad, because it's predominantly Jewish and no Palestinians are allowed to live there. So it's a typical Palestinian Nakba story where both of my grandparents, my parents were forced out of their towns and cities and villages at gunpoint. They were exiled and they had to leave their towns and go and seek refuge in neighboring towns. For instance, my father's father, they had to go from Safad. They were forced out of Safad and then they fled to Haifa, and then they ended up settling in Akka. My grandfather, my father's paternal grandfather, used to be a train driver during the British Mandate. And his story is quite interesting because once the Zionist militias took over, he was actually captured and he was imprisoned. And he was on his way to be hanged, basically, when they realized that there weren't much train drivers left and they need someone to operate the train. So that's the only thing that, quote unquote, saved him. My mother's side of the family, they were also obviously exiled. My grandfather watched his friends and neighbors being, rounded up in city squares in Majd al-Krum, and they were just executed and shot. So that was a very traumatic experience for him as a teenager at that time. My grandmother's story is how, and this is something that is supported by not only Palestinian scholars, but also Jewish and even Zionist Jewish scholars, about how the crimes against humanity that were committed by Zionist militias, including violence against women, in that sense, mass rape. So my grandmother told me how, because this was very widespread, her mother put dirt on her face and her sister's face as they were forced out of their village, so that they don't attract attention and, to protect them from being targets of sexual violence by Zionist militias. So it's a very grim, but also inspiring stories. It's a story of sumud. It's a story of resilience. It's a story of continuing and no matter what, continuing and being determined that this is our right and this is our land and this is our home and we don't have any other homes and we're not going to go anywhere.
Absolutely, I totally agree with you. It's horrible how the Zionists were terrorists from day one, clearly. By the way, there were Jews actually in Palestine, obviously, before the arrival of the Zionists. And I guess those Jews were living with everybody, like everybody, right?
Yes, that's true. There was Palestinian Jews. They called themselves Palestinians, just like Christians call themselves Palestinians and Muslims call themselves Palestinians. There are people who lived in Palestine were Palestinians. So regardless to their religious background, in that sense. And my grandmother and my father, they had Jewish neighbors who my grandmother breastfed, for instance, and that wasn't uncommon because in Palestine, this is what people did. They grow up, they raise children together, Christian, Muslims, and Jews, and this is part of just nurturing, your neighbors' sons and daughters, and being a community. So there was a sense of community and belonging amongst all Palestinians in there.
Yeah, there's this myth that Muslims and Jews were like were foes since forever. but this is all mythology, and it's completely false and contradicts simple history, like historiography, which has been written, right?
Absolutely. And not just contradicts history, it contradicts facts that are happening now on the ground. So even now we see alliances between Jewish Zionists and Muslim Zionists happening, and these alliances are being forged in the region, for instance, in Israel, with the normalization with Arab countries in the region, but also domestically sometimes, and in domestic Israeli politics, we can see that, for instance, in the government that Lapid and Bennett have just formed, you have an Islamic party. So what does that tell you? It's not really a religious issue. At its core, it's a settler colonial anti-racist struggle. Of course, there's that aspect of Islam and Christianity and Judaism, because this happens to be part of the region, and people who are the target of colonialism happen to be Christians and Muslims at this stage. I mean, we can of course we can discuss the ways in which settler colonialism has impacted the Jewish native Palestinian community as well, and there's also research on that. But Zionism as a movement is a Jewish supremacist movement. It's a settler colonial Jewish supremacist movement. So
yeah, excellent point. It has nothing to do with religion, really. The religious explanation is just like for the layman who doesn't want to dig further and look into the reality, right? Yeah, at the end of the day, it's a purely colonial ideology based on hierarchy and domination of a group of people over others. Can you tell us what or when did you realize growing up that you were actually like, I don't know how you would call yourself, like, is it a second-class citizen or a subject of this colonial state? When did you like realize? Was there a specific event or not?
Now that's a really good question, because so growing up in Israel as a Palestinian, you are brought into you live and grow up in a highly hostile environment. So from day one, I mean, they label us as a demographic threat, right? We are a demographic threat. So our existence, our mere existence is a threat to them, which makes us, by logic of extension, legitimate targets, right? So there's that one underlying argument that supports the whole existence of this Jewish supremacy, but also in order to stop and prevent the Palestinian right of return, obviously. So you can definitely feel that growing up. And there's no one instance where you go, oh, wow, but you are brought up in a system that it's very easy for you to draw these conclusions and infer that this system doesn't like me. This system, it's hostile. It constantly targets my existence. I'm constantly being reminded that this is not my place. Like, with the whole Jewish nation state bill, it's something that we've been saying for ages. Growing up in Israel, there's no mistake. Like, there's no mistake. If you're a Palestinian, you would know that this behaves like a Jewish state. It doesn't behave like a democratic state. Me as a Palestinian, my existence is targeted. I don't have equal rights, but also it's beyond just having equal rights. It's being the target. It's being the target of that Zionist settler colonial project. And of course, that permeates to all levels. And it reflects in all sectors of life as well. So it's hard to ignore that fact. And like, even as a child, no one needs to tell you, but because you're constantly being told not to speak Arabic, or not to raise your flag, for instance, or don't live here, or this is an area that is, you're culturally unfit to live in certain kibbutzes, for instance. So there's more than like tangible examples from lived experiences that would immediately let you know that this place is hostile. And that doesn't stop there. It's not just about you're not being welcomed and you're being unwanted and your freedom is being restricted. It's also like physical. It goes all the way up to physical harm. There's many instances of Palestinians who were just attacked in Palestine in 1948 because they spoke Arabic, for example, or for protesting, for exercising democratic rights. In 2000, during the second Intifada, 13 Palestinian Israeli citizens were shot and killed because they were just protesting in support of Palestinians in the West Bank. And at that time, if you remember, Muhammad al-Durra video was released. So yeah, these are all examples. And of course, these are, I'm talking about practices. I haven't got to the level of the law and how the law basically is formed in a way that kind of maintains my status as an indigenous person in my homeland, as a marginalized and basically a second-class citizen. So there's definitely, growing up as a Palestinian in Israel, there's practical, tangible examples that you get from your lived experience, and that tells you that you are not in a safe environment. But there's also that legal level to it that cements all these practices. And that legal level basically is the laws. It's over 63 laws that target Palestinians and discriminate against Palestinians in Israel.
How did that impact your social life? Because I guess you went to school with Jewish friends and to university. So I think it's super weird, right? Because it's like they know, but maybe they pretend to not. And maybe you can play normally at times, and at other times everyone has to go back to their own their own category.
Yeah, and it's a shame because the real barrier to nurturing and developing social relationship with your Jewish neighbors is the fact that at some point they will go to the military, and that is not, of course, it's not just like a one-off event, and it's not something that happens suddenly when they turn 18. We know that the indoctrination and the Zionism, in the sense that the whole dehumanization and demonization of Palestinians starts from a very early age, in kindergarten and in primary schools. It's in their curriculum. So that starts early. But even if there's any chance for lived experience and any social exchange to change that kind of indoctrination, so that might happen, let's say, during school or when you talk to your neighbors or you do all these sort of things, that basically is stopped. And you cannot continue beyond the military. So that ceiling, the military ceiling, shall we call it, it is because Israel is a hyper militarized society. By the end of the day, everyone has to go to military. I mean, according to the law, but there's ways around it. So some people refuse, and they choose to serve 6 months in prison instead. But predominantly, it's a mandatory conscription.
Okay, so growing up, you had like this weird relationship with your Jewish friends. But then, how, for example, when you studied history in school, I think there's a big emphasis on the Holocaust, right? So how could they reconcile in those lessons or reconcile the fact that Jews were destroyed by Europeans, but the enemy is the Palestinians? So how does that work?
Yeah, and yes, that's a good question, because look, what Zionism does is that it weaponizes the memory of the Holocaust victims, and it weaponizes anti-Semitism in a way to promote settler colonial agenda. So these people are taught that, and there is that sense of the ultimate victim kind of syndrome, that we're always going to be the victims. And Europe, this is what the Europeans did to us, and now we are in a very so they say that they are surrounded by enemies, and they need to protect themselves and their borders because they're surrounded by enemies. So while it's true that, you know, in Europe, they were the target of, you know, unspeakable crimes against humanity, and they were the victim of Europeans. But in the context of Palestine, they're not the victims. They're definitely not my victim. They're not the victims of my grandparents. And they're not the victims of 6 million Palestinian refugees who are denied the right of return. They're not the victims of people living under apartheid in the West Bank or Gaza. So in this case, they're not the victim. And it's important to kind of make that distinction. But yeah, just to speak to that point, I think it's important that we do not conflate between Zionism and Judaism. And while Zionism is a settler colonial movement that predominantly, it is a European product. It's a product of the Renaissance. It's a product of the nation state, the whole nation state ideology that was basically, you know, conceived in Europe. And it's not native to Palestine in that sense, Zionism. Judaism, on the other hand, is. But Judaism as a culture, Judaism as a religion, as a culture, is native, whereas Zionism and in the way that it reflects today in the Israeli state is definitely not something that is native to Palestine.
Yeah, well, what history shows, you know it full well, better than myself, I'm sure, is that Zionists actually, and this is what Hannah Arendt, which Zionists absolutely detest, right?
Yeah.
She said it in her book, The Origins of Totalitarianism, and also in Eichmann in Jerusalem, that Zionists worked hand in hand with the Nazis in order to get the Jews out of Germany and other occupied territories by the Nazis in order to fulfill their agenda of colonizing Palestine. So yeah, this is the true face of Zionists. They don't care about the interest of Jews, really. They just want to fulfill their settler colonial project, like you said, and yeah. So do you confirm that Zionists absolutely hate Hannah Arendt and probably don't mention her at all in school or university programs? I was always curious, really.
There's many non-Zionist Jews that Zionism want to kind of erase, because that obviously that doesn't serve their narrative that they are the Jewish state and they are the representatives of the Jewish people or all around the world. So yes, many of them, including Ilan Pappé, who was also a lecturer at the University of Haifa and then had some issues with his ethnic cleansing books. And had to leave the university and leave the country by the end of the day. So yeah, so and this feeds back into that, again, indoctrination, and that many non-Zionist Jewish people are unheard of in Israel. So Israelis don't know. They don't know that some Jewish people actually, that you can be Jewish and you can be anti-Zionist. They don't know that. Some people, you know, to the extent where some non-Zionist Jews that live in the same small geographical area as myself when I used to live back in Akka, or I didn't hear of them until I left. So we met outside of Israel. So it's not only they erase them, but they keep us and them divided and separate in compartments so that we don't discover each other and then suddenly realize that, so there is a movement. Just to speak to that point.
Yeah, they invisibilize you. I don't know if it's a word in English, but they make you invisible.
Yes.
Typical. And to some extent they succeed because it's the state, and the state is very powerful. Another historical fact is that if anything, Muslims have always protected the Jews, including during the Holocaust in Europe. And it happened. It was the case way before that, because, for example, when Jews were excluded from Spain in 1492, they went to North Africa mainly. Some of them went to the Middle East, but the easiest, of course, was to go to North Africa. And they were welcome in North Africa. They stayed 4.5 centuries, if not more. and they were able to keep their culture, their religion, the freedom to practice it. Nobody told them to convert to Islam, unlike what they were asked to do when they were back in Europe, in Spain. And the stance of the current Tunisian president, his name is Said. He said he's anti-Israel, clearly, anti-Zionist. But as soon as he was elected, he said, my position is that we are with Palestinians and we are against Israel. However, we are not against Jews. And he said that his own father used to take, you know, Giselle Halimi, she died not too long ago. She was a Jewish activist. She lived in France in the last years. She grew up in Tunisia. And during the Holocaust, because she was a Jewish girl, if she went to school with her parents, it was possible for her parents to be arrested, and her too, and to be deported to Europe, to concentration camps. So what the father of this Tunisian president, the current Tunisian president, did, he took her himself to school every day, because he clearly wasn't Jewish. So people would think she's not Jewish either. So they would leave him alone, right? So that's what he did. Every day he took her to school, so she could go to school.
Yeah.
She wouldn't stay at home, and she wouldn't risk being deported, and her parents too. So this is the reality of things, right?
Yeah.
But when you listen to Zionists or to European powers, the story is totally different. They try to rewrite history and portray Muslims as the forever feuds with the Jews, and they're both savages and they fight all the time. It has been like that forever, but it's absolutely false, right?
Yes, I agree. Yeah, I 100% agree with you, but I think it's important that this kind of framing of the conflict is tackled. So, and this is not just, so we hear this, for instance, in mainstream media, where they say, oh, both sides, as if this is an issue that they're like, both sides are equal and both sides have equal stakes and both sides have equal power, whereas we know that this is not the case. This is the case of, an asymmetric warfare, where on one hand you have a state actor versus non-state actor. On the one hand, you have a settler colonial project, and on the other hand, you have indigenous colonized people. So so there's a lot of misconceptions around, and not just misconceptions, I would say even misinformation. There's misinformation. This propaganda. That's what the media does. The media wants everyone to think that this is like, all these Muslims and Jews, they have been fighting since forever. So this is just very complex. And to speak to that point of complexity, and that this is a complex situation and we don't really understand, which I actually disagree with strongly, because it's not, it's plain, it's settler colonialism versus indigenous population. And
you have the oppressor and you have the oppressed. It's very clear.
Exactly. Yeah, and this whole argument of this is complex, it's basically to prevent people from taking stance against it, because they don't want people, because if you look at the picture and you realize, you don't have to be a researcher or a scientist or to know that this is a case where we have, on the one hand, a very strong and powerful actor that is supported and backed by the international community. And when I say the international
empire and the dominant empire, right?
Exactly, by empires and by international community. And when I say international community, I don't mean obviously the grassroots, I mean the official formal level of the international community. And on the other hand, you have people who are living under siege, and then you have people living in Bantustans, and people living as second-class citizens, and people that are denied the right to go back home. So it's not that complex. I don't think that's complex. And anyone who sees that kind of framing, would be easier for them to take a stance, a moral stance on the matter, which is obviously not in favor of Israel. But for them to be able, how do you justify murdering children? How do you justify killing children? you say, oh, it's complex. It's not about the children. They, you know, and you present that complexity argument that it's complex and it's not exactly what you see. There's more behind it. And these children are used as human shields and whatnot.
Exactly.
But in fact,
they're terrorists, right?
It's indefensible. It's indefensible. The Zionist project is indefensible, and they know that. And they use all these terminologies and tactics and hasbara strategies to kind of let people, you know, make people feel like they shouldn't take a stance because there's so many things that they don't know.
So what is this hasbara strategy?
It's basically, you know, discrediting what people know. So it's saying, oh, you know, it's very complex. So you don't know enough. You don't know enough about this topic. So maybe you shouldn't take a stance. It's very complex. And it dates back to, you know, so the point that we were discussing.
Right. So talking about propaganda. There's the term that we find everywhere, unfortunately. Palestinian-Israeli conflict, which I mean, it's ridiculous because you have like it's like the Goliath, David versus Goliath thing, and you say it's a conflict, right?
yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Or another situation, it's the same as seeing a woman being attacked by thugs, by guys, and then you say, oh, it's a conflict. We shouldn't. Yeah,
it's a conflict
between them. It's between them, right?
Yeah.
Or you would say it's a fight. They're just fighting. And you have like 5 guys against 1 woman. Yeah, really. I mean, it's the same logic, right?
That's true. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, if you say it's a conflict, you should then be logical with yourself.
The problem is that it's that they're equating between the victim and the oppressor. They're equating between you know, the colonized people and the settler colonial project. So yes, that is the problem.
Yeah, and they portray, like you said, Palestinians as, I remember a few years ago, I haven't been watching TV for 20 years, but before that, I remember on French TV, systematically they were saying Palestinian terrorists and Israeli soldiers.
Yeah, that's true.
One way to instill the ideology in minds of people.
Yeah, and this is what this is really. It's just victim blaming. It's you know, when you label people who are living under occupation,
it's their fault.
Who are struggling for liberation, it's and they're like, of course it's their fault. There's nothing we can do that they are going to be happy with us. It doesn't matter what we do
anyway.
Yeah, exactly. So this is, I think it's an important point to address, that the fact that we shouldn't really fall into victim blaming. And the way to tackle that is to look at the bigger picture and look at the context. Yeah, the Palestinian cause is not the product of what happened last month in Gaza or Sheikh Jarrah. What happened in Gaza and Sheikh Jarrah is a continuation of ethnic cleansing and dispossession and settler colonial policies that we've seen since 1948. Even before 1948, the settler colonial project has started.
Yes,
it just that it decided to accelerate in 1948, exactly, and just take a militant shape in the sense that they decided to go in there as militias. But the acquisition of land, the purchasing of land, the restricting of lands from Palestinians started way before 1948. So it's important to keep in mind that these structures that we have, whether it's the Nakba in 1948, and the ethnic cleansing, whether it's the Naksi in 1967, the apartheid system that we see today in the West Bank and in Gaza, all of these structures are structures of settler colonialism.
Absolutely. Yeah, it's typical. It resonates a lot with me because France was doing exactly the same in Algeria. And just, like you said, people were killed because they spoke Arabic. It's because when you speak Arabic or you claim your identity under a colonial rule like this one, it's like a revolutionary act. You're like telling them, you guys are liars. And it's like screaming that into their face, and they can't tolerate it. And they have to eliminate you right away. And the elimination to do, and the permanent one, like definitive one, is to kill you, of course. That's why they kill.
Yes. And that's because the underlying, because the underlying premise of settler colonialism is that this is empty land, it's terra nullius, you know?
Yeah.
And we see that logic and that argument being played out, not just in Palestine, but here in Australia as well, where they say this was terra nullius, there were no indigenous people, so we arrived, this land was empty. And in Palestine, that equates, you know, that argument is manifested when they say it was an empty land for, you know, for people with no land, so it was empty. And again, this where that's where it comes from, that they constantly target your existence as an indigenous group, as people who have been there clearly.
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, with people with the culture, with the language, with
Yes.
and they can't tolerate that. And
No.
what the I mean, it's so ridiculous what the settlers used to do in Algeria, and I'm sure they did it elsewhere. Maybe they did more or less the same in Palestine. Is that they used to take pictures with the traditional Algerian dress, you see, to take the place of the Algerian pictures, you know, to like establish sort of historiography, an attempt, at least a desperate to establish
appropriation. To
establish some sort of reality when reality is completely different. It's pathetic, but it's exactly what they were doing.
They want to appropriate the land, they want to appropriate the culture, but they don't want the people. They just, so
exactly.
I always say that Palestine is not mainly about land, it's about the people. It's targeting the people of that land. I mean, you know, the settler Zionist project has also been very detrimental to the land as well, as we know, in terms of you know, environmental terrorism and stuff. Well, destruction, what they've done to the Dead Sea, what they've done to the water. So that's also we can also argue that, but I think mainly it's about emptying that land from people. So that logic of elimination that Patrick Wolf spoke of is very clear.
And regarding the destruction, including of the environment, it reveals the parasitic nature of these settler colonial enterprises. They don't care about anything. It's just about using in a completely unsustainable manner and just throwing it away. And when they destroy the earth, what will they do you think? Of course, they will go to Mars, like you know. So easy. Colonize Mars. Colonize it. That's what is the word they use.
Very aggressive and very detrimental, and it's just something that nothing can come out unharmed from. Nothing, not culture, not people, not land, nothing.
Not
so
animals,
it is about
nothing.
It's about white supremacy, and it's about maintaining that supremacy and extending it. And it's very Orientalist in the way that it does it, and it sees people and land and cultures as a function of or as resources in which they can utilize to maintain those structures and make more profits and become richer.
Exactly, it's about profits.
So it is about exploitation, it's about domination and exploitation.
In the next part,
there's been lots of statements from Israeli officials that they say that they want to put Gaza on a diet. They count the calories. They count the calories of food and what the food intake of Gazans. So that level of domination is simply sick. Like it's that level of
it's sadistic.
Yeah, it's sadistic.